He spent a decade studying how technology could lift Africa out of poverty. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on failed government programs, on how good intentions get hollowed out by men who skim off the top. Then he became one of them. This is the story of Mahad Ibrahim, Berkeley PhD, humanitarian researcher, Ebola outbreak data analyst, and prosecutors say a key architect in the largest pandemic fraud scheme in American history. Long before Minnesota ever heard his name, Mahad Ibrahim was building an impressive resume in an entirely different world. He earned his PhD in 2009 from the University of California, Berkeley's School of Information, a program built around a deceptively simple question. How does technology actually change people's lives versus how governments claim it does? His dissertation research took him to Egypt, where he was hired to evaluate a national program that had rolled out thousands of internet access centers meant to connect rural citizens to the digital world. Ibrahim didn't just read the reports, he called the centers himself. Many numbers didn't add up, phones that didn't work, addresses that turned out to be grocery stores. He traveled to Aswan, where records claimed 23 centers were operating. He found 4. His conclusion, at the time, was almost prophetic. The program had failed because government officials picked partners whose real mission had nothing to do with the technology they were supposedly delivering. Organizations that existed on paper more than in practice. The work was serious enough to earn him a research fellowship through Berkeley's Center for African Studies. This was a man who had built an academic career on catching exactly the kind of institutional fiction he would later be accused of building himself. It's the kind of irony this genre lives for. In 2015, Ibrahim was on the front lines of the West African Ebola outbreak, walking through the dirt paths of a Liberian township with contact tracers, helping build the data systems used to track the deadly virus and stop its spread. He was, on paper, exactly the kind of person a struggling nonprofit sector needed. A data scientist who understood both bureaucracy and human suffering, who had seen up close what happens when oversight fails and money doesn't reach the people it's meant for. By the late 2010s, he'd settled outside Minneapolis and turned that expertise toward a new venture, a nonprofit called ThinkTechAct Foundation, which would later operate under a second name, Foundry Learning Foundation. ThinkTechAct set up shop in a co-working space in Edina, an affluent Minneapolis suburb. Respectable address, respectable name. Under the Feeding Our Future umbrella, Ibrahim's nonprofit opened dozens of meal sites across the state. But the real engine of the operation was a partnership. Ibrahim aligned himself with Abdiaziz Farah, co-owner of a Shakopee restaurant called Empire Cuisine and Market, which claimed to supply the food for many of these sites. Farah would later be convicted at the first Feeding Our Future trial. Ibrahim, prosecutors say, later admitted he took deliberate steps not to look too closely at what his partners were actually doing, while still cashing the payouts that came his way. He wasn't just a business partner to this network, he was, by multiple accounts, a mentor figure. Mukhtar Mohammed Sharif, another defendant later convicted and sentenced to 17 years for stealing $40 million in the scheme, testified that he was personally introduced to the fraud by Ibrahim, describing him as a respected elder at their shared mosque community. That's a detail that matters for understanding how this scheme spread the way it did. It didn't move through cold business pitches. It moved through trust, community standing, and the credibility of a man with a Berkeley doctorate behind his name. Here's where the scale of it becomes almost unbelievable. Under Ibrahim's foundation, sites tied to a single suburban mosque claimed to serve as many as 6,000 children's meals a day, a number a Bloomington school official later testified was simply not physically possible at that location. State investigators would eventually determine that ThinkTechAct and its affiliated sites received more than $18 million in federal reimbursements. And according to Minnesota's Attorney General, more than $21 million in nonprofit assets flowed through Ibrahim personally, with over 14 million of that steered onward to companies owned by his partner Farah. Guilty. 1 count of wire fraud, 1 count of money laundering. He became the 50th conviction in a case that would eventually pull in more than 70 defendants. As part of the deal, he agreed to forfeit more than $2.7 million in seized bank accounts and over $600,000 in equity from his Ohio home, with restitution that could climb past $7 million. The man who once traveled to Liberia to help track a deadly virus, who once picked apart a government's internet program phone booth by phone booth because he refused to accept a number without checking it himself, that same instinct for scrutiny, prosecutors say, he simply switched off when it came to his own operation. His plea agreement puts him somewhere between 5 and 11 years in federal prison. The scholar who built a career exposing how institutions fail vulnerable people ended up, according to the government, running one of the schemes that failed them worst. Mahad Ibrahim's sentencing is still pending as this case grinds toward its end. One more name on a list of more than 70 in a scandal that stretched from Minneapolis strip malls to a Berkeley dissertation to a suburban Ohio subdivision. Next episode, we follow the money further into the fundraiser lists and the mosque connections and ask how a scheme this size stayed hidden from state regulators for so long.